The longhouse was a tomb filled with dozens of perfectly preserved Vikings, all dead from starvation. But here's what made Dr. Elara Holm's blood run cold. The food stores were almost entirely untouched. Barrels of salted cod, racks of dried meat, enough to last through the harshest winter. They hadn't run out of food, they had simply stopped eating. Why would an entire village choose to starve to death while surrounded by sustenance? The answer lay buried in the ice, waiting to claim its next victims. The world below was an equation of two variables, ice and sky. From the window of the transport helicopter, the Greenland ice cap stretched into a white infinity, a place that swallowed scale and erased perspective. It was a sterile, featureless desert, beautiful and terrifying in its sheer, implacable emptiness. Inside the rattling fuselage, Dr. Elara Holm was oblivious to the view. Her world was confined to the glowing screen of a ruggedized tablet resting on her knees. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, her eyes tracing lines of geological survey data, cross-referencing them with digitized copies of ancient Viking sea charts. She wasn't seeing ice. She was seeing possibilities, probabilities, the faint 1,000-year-old ghost of a path. Opposite her, Dr. Anders Larsen was also seeing possibilities, but of a very different kind. He was a large man, whose personality seemed to take up more space than his body, and his voice, amplified by the satellite phone pressed to his ear, boomed over the thrum of the rotors. "That's correct, Maria. Yes, landmark is not too strong a word," he declared, a wide, confident smile spreading across his face. "We have every reason to believe this will be the northernmost Viking settlement ever discovered. Not just a temporary camp, mind you, but a permanent foothold. Imagine it, a testament to their sheer, indomitable will." Elara didn't look up, but a small muscle in her jaw tightened. Larsen was a brilliant archaeologist, but he was also a showman, a man who saw history as a narrative to be sold. He spoke of will and sagas. Elara trusted in soil stratigraphy and carbon dating. Larsen was speaking to the press, crafting the story before the first shovel had even touched the ground. Elara just kept tracing the lines, following the data. The data, unlike a good story, had no agenda. The base camp was a small, defiant cluster of high-tech geodesic tents pitched against the relentless wind. Weeks of painstaking work had followed their arrival. The ground-penetrating radar, an almost magical eye that could see through time, had confirmed their hopes. Buried just meters below the permafrost lay the unmistakable outline of a Viking longhouse. Now, Larsen directed the excavation with the theatrical gravitas of a conductor leading an orchestra. He stood at the edge of the growing pit, pointing, instructing, his voice carrying over the wind, ensuring everyone understood the historic importance of their work. Elara, however, was already far from the grand performance. She was on her knees at the far edge of the site, her attention focused not on the structure, but on the earth itself. Ben Carter, her junior assistant, a young man whose eagerness burned bright enough to keep the cold at bay, brought her a core sample in a sterilized tube. "Got another one for you, Dr. Holm, from the eastern perimeter." She took it, sliding the frozen cylinder of earth into her gloved palm. Larsen saw a building. Elara saw an environment, a system. The story of who these people were and what happened to them wasn't just in the house they built, but in the ground they lived on. She crumbled a piece between her fingers, her brow furrowed. The soil composition was unusual, a higher than expected concentration of certain mineral deposits. An anomaly. And Elara Holm lived for anomalies. It took another 3 weeks to breach the entrance. The work was slow, brutal, a battle against the frozen ground. When they finally cleared the doorway, a hush fell over the team. The longhouse was almost perfectly preserved, a ship locked in a bottle of ice. The air inside was still, frigid, and carried the faint, dry scent of ancient timber and something else, something unsettlingly sterile. They moved in slowly, their headlamps cutting sharp beams through the gloom. And then they found him. The first one. A man, his back against the wall, frozen solid. He was painfully emaciated, his cheekbones sharp, his skin stretched taut over his skull, but it was his face that stopped Elara's breath. There was no terror in it, no agony. His eyes were closed, and his lips were parted in a faint, unmistakable expression of serene calm. Larsen swore, a sharp, guttural sound. Before anyone could process it, Ben Eslight found another figure, a woman clutching a small bundle of furs that might have once been a child. And then another, and another. The longhouse was a tomb, a cache of bodies, dozens of them, men, women, children, all scattered in the final, still poses of death, all of them stick-thin, all of them eerily, unnervingly peaceful. Larsen, for the first time since Elara had known him, was stunned into absolute silence. The grand narrative he had been spinning for the press had just collided with a horrifying, inexplicable reality. Ben made a choked sound, his face pale in the reflected glow of his headlamp. He pointed a trembling hand toward the back of the longhouse. And as Elara looked, the food stores, barrels of salted cod and smoked puffin, racks of dried meat, leather sacks of grain, they were almost entirely untouched. A small portion had been used, but there was enough preserved food to last a settlement of this size through the harshest of winters. They hadn't run out of food, they had simply stopped eating. The paradox hung in the frozen air, a question so loud it was like a scream. Why would an entire village choose to starve to death while surrounded by sustenance? While the others stared in horrified disbelief, Elara's mind shifted gears. The anthropologist took over. This was no longer just a tragedy, it was a data set. She moved from body to body, her gaze clinical, her mind a checklist. No signs of violence, no defensive wounds, no struggle, just a quiet, collective fade into oblivion. She knelt by a young woman, her long braids still perfectly intact, her face a mask of placid acceptance. Larsen finally found his voice, shaking off the shock and reasserting his control. The showman was back, the conductor trying to regain his orchestra. "It must have been a blight," he announced, his voice a little too loud in the silent tomb. "A fungus, something that contaminated the food source, made it toxic." They realized it too late, had nothing else to eat, and in this. He gestured around the room, already formulating a hypothesis, a neat, controllable explanation that could be written down in a report, a story that made sense. But as Elara looked at the peaceful frozen faces and the untouched barrels of food, she knew, with a certainty that chilled her more than the ice, that whatever happened here, it was not going to be a story that made sense. The paradox of the longhouse, a tomb filled with sated ghosts, had settled over the camp like a shroud. While Larsen worked the satellite phone, managing the narrative and crafting a story of fungal blight for the university, Elara retreated to the one place where stories held no currency. Her lab. The forensics tent was a bubble of sterile light and humming machinery against the vast frozen dark of Greenland. Here, the only truth was the one that could be measured, catalogued, and proven. Ben assisted, his youthful face grim as he passed her sterilized instruments. On the metal table lay the first subject, a Viking man whose calm, frozen face seemed to mock their efforts. For Elara, the body was no longer a man, but a vessel of information, the final witness. With practiced precision, she performed the autopsy, her movements economical and exact. The cause of death was obvious, an undeniable severe malnutrition, system failure from starvation. But the cause of starvation was the question that echoed in the silent tent. Finally, she reached the stomach. Inside, she found not the remnants of salted fish or dried meat, but a dark, fibrous, almost felt-like mass. Sample catalogued as 7-alpha, Ben said, his voice low as he sealed a specimen jar. Elara prepared a slide, her hands steady. She carried it to the powerful electron microscope in the corner, a machine that could peel back the layers of the visible world. As she adjusted the focus, the monitor flickered to life, displaying the alien landscape of the sample. And there, amidst the digested fibers, she saw it. It wasn't a fungus. It wasn't a known blight. It was a lichen, but like none she had ever seen documented. Its structure was exquisitely crystalline, forming intricate, almost geometric patterns of silver and grey. It was beautiful, alien, and utterly out of place. Later that night, in the relative warmth of the mess tent, Elara presented her findings. She projected the microscope image onto a portable screen. The strange, beautiful crystals glowed in the dim light. "It's a lichen," she stated, her tone flat and factual. "A species I'm not familiar with, but its structure is consistent with certain alkaloid-producing organisms. I've cross-referenced its crystalline signature with the toxicology database. It's rare, but there are mentions in obscure botanical texts. It's highly psychoactive." Larsen, who had been listening with a tense frown, suddenly lit up. His relief was a palpable force in the room. He slapped the table, a broad, triumphant smile erasing the worry from his face. "Brilliant! Elara, brilliant! That's it! That's our answer!" He stood and began to pace, his voice regaining its familiar, booming confidence. "It's a tragic but simple miscalculation. The winter was harsh. Their supplies were running low, so they foraged. They found this lichen, mistook it for an edible species, and consumed it. A mass hallucination. They would have been too disoriented, too lost in their own minds to even think of eating. They simply faded away. It's a neat, tidy tragedy." He beamed at the rest of the team, selling the story. But Elara wasn't buying it. "Anders," she cut in, her voice quiet but firm. "The concentrations are too high. From my initial analysis, the amount in the first subject's stomach alone would have required consuming several kilograms of the raw lichen. That's not an accident. No one accidentally eats that much of something they don't recognize." Larsen's smile tightened. He stopped pacing and looked at her, his expression hardening from relief to annoyance. "Don't complicate this, Elara. We have a clear scientific explanation. It's elegant. It's logical. Let's not muddy the waters with unprovable conjecture. The report will state death by accidental ingestion of a psychoactive agent." His tone was final. The discussion was over. He had found his story, and he would not let her meticulous doubts get in the way. A few days later, on a necessary supply run to a small coastal depot, Elara took a detour. She had the helicopter drop her 2 kilometers away from the Inuit village that served as their official liaison, preferring to walk in and show respect. She found the elder, Lichen, sitting outside his small modern home, carving a piece of driftwood. He was a man whose age was impossible to guess, his face a roadmap of deep lines, his eyes holding a watchful, quiet dignity. After observing the courtesies, Elara took out her tablet and showed him the image from the microscope. She didn't offer a name, just the glowing, crystalline picture. Lichen looked at it, and his hands, so steady with the carving knife moments before, went still. A shadow passed over his face. "We know this," he said, his voice a low rumble. He did not point to the screen. He pointed out toward the vast empty ice sheet. "It is not for food." He looked at Elara, his gaze intense. "We call it Tungumma, the stone dream." Elara felt a prickle of unease. "The stone dream? It is a gift," Lichen continued, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. "Offered by the Selanap Nipasua, the white silence. When the winter is too long, when the world is too hard, the silence offers this, a waking dream of peace. It takes away the hunger, the cold, the fear. It is a lure, a kind mercy from which you do not return." He was not telling a folk tale. He was stating a fact, a piece of ancestral knowledge as solid to him as Elara's data was to her. He was describing an active agent, a presence, the white silence. He spoke its name as if it were listening. Back at the camp, the sun was beginning to set, painting the ice in hues of orange and purple. Ben was working late, dutifully taking atmospheric readings near the open moor of the longhouse. The wind was picking up, a low moan that seemed to rise from the tomb itself. It carried with it a fine glittering dust from the excavation earth, ice crystals and something more. Spores. As the wind swirled around him, Ben heard it. A faint, impossibly beautiful sound. It was a melody, a high ethereal harmony that seemed to have no source. He froze, turning his head, straining his ears. It wasn't the wind. It was structured, deliberate, melodic. He scanned the empty landscape. There was no one there. The camp was 100 meters behind him. The sound seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then, as quickly as it came, it faded, leaving only the lonely cry of the wind. Ben stood there for a long time, a deep shiver running through him that had nothing to do with the cold. The silence that returned was heavier, more profound than the silence that had come before. Larsen's tidy narrative of accidental poisoning was a flimsy shield against the profound wrongness of the longhouse, and Elara knew it. While he broadcast his convenient truth to the university, she retreated once more to the glowing sanctuary of the forensics tent. If she was going to dismantle his story, she needed more than doubt. She needed irrefutable, quantitative proof. For days, she worked tirelessly, feeding every scrap of data she had gathered into the camp's most powerful computer autopsy results: tissue densities, atmospheric conditions, the precise chemical breakdown of the psychoactive lichen. She wasn't just analyzing data anymore. She was rebuilding a life, or rather, the last days of one. On her main monitor, a holographic 3D model of the Viking woman's digestive tract shimmered into existence. It was a ghostly, translucent map of the victim's final moments. With a few keystrokes, Elara initiated a simulation, a metabolic reconstruction designed to answer a single question. How long would it take to achieve the concentration of lichen found in the stomach? She expected the answer to be hours, maybe a full day of confused foraging. But the simulation ran on, the numbers climbing, the timeline stretching. Elara leaned closer, her breath fogging in the cold air. The program finally stopped, the result blinking on the screen in stark red letters. The lichen wasn't a supplement. It wasn't a side dish. For at least 5 days, possibly as long as a week, it had been their entire diet. The simulation showed zero traces of any other food. It was a deliberate, systematic, and sustained act of consumption, a ritual, a procedure. Larsen's theory of a simple accident was not just wrong, it was impossible. Armed with this new, terrifying certainty, Elara returned to the longhouse. The other team members saw a tomb, a site to be catalogued. She now saw a crime scene, a place of methodical madness. The Vikings' actions had been deliberate, and deliberate actions leave traces beyond the body. Convinced she had missed something, she began a new search, not as an archaeologist, but as a detective. She ignored the skeletons and the barrels of food. She focused on the walls. She ran her gloved hands over the rough-hewn timber, feeling for imperfections, for anything that broke the pattern. For hours she searched, her obsession a small flame against the oppressive cold. And then she found it. Behind a loose, soot-stained stone in the great central hearth, her fingers brushed against a different texture. Not wood, but carved stone, a hidden panel. With her heart pounding, she pried it loose. This was the midpoint, the heart of the mystery. Elara aimed her high-intensity flashlight into the dark recess. The beam fell upon a hidden cache of carvings, perfectly preserved from the elements. Her breath caught in her throat. These were not the usual Viking motifs of coiled serpents, great ships, or warring gods. This was something else entirely. One section of the wall was covered in a sprawling, deeply carved spiral pattern, an intricate design that swirled and branched in a way that was hauntingly familiar. Elara's mind flashed back to the image on her microscope. It was a perfect, macroscopic representation of the crystalline lichen. The artist had carved what they had seen in their mind's eye. But it was the central image that made the blood freeze in her veins. It was the haunting figure of a person. They were not screaming in terror or fighting for their life. They were on their knees, head tilted back, arms outstretched. Their eyes were carved wide, serene and empty, staring up in rapture at the swirling lichen pattern that seemed to emanate from the very stone. This wasn't a warning. It wasn't a record of a tragedy. It was a depiction of worship, an icon of blissful surrender. They weren't poisoned. They were communing. That night, the mess tent buzzed with tension. Elara strode in and slapped a series of photographs down on the table in front of Larsen. They were crystal clear images of the carvings. "Explain this, Anders," she said, her voice low and tight. Larsen stared at the pictures, his face draining of color. He saw his neat, tidy, career-making theory being torn to shreds by this pagan graffiti. His mind scrambled for a foothold, for a way to contain it, to explain it away. But for a moment, he had nothing. Elara pressed her advantage. This wasn't an accident. This was a ritual. They worshipped this thing. They willingly starved themselves as some kind of offering. The fear in Larsen's eyes hardened into fury. He slammed his hand down on the photos, covering the serene, staring face of the carved figure. "No! I will not have this expedition derailed by fantasy," he roared, his voice shaking with rage. "You spend one afternoon with the local mystics, and suddenly you're an expert on Viking death cults. This is what happens when you project folktales onto the evidence." "This isn't a folktale. It's right there in the stone," Elara shot back, her own anger rising. "I see what I see. A desperate, starving people carving their fever dreams onto a wall. You are sensationalizing this, Holm. For what? A headline?" He stood up, towering over her. "You're off the project. Effective immediately. I'm placing you on administrative leave for compromising the integrity of this site. You will be confined to your tent, your tablet, your samples, your notes. They are all expedition property." He signaled to two of his loyal team members. "See to it." Before Elara could even protest, they were moving, confiscating her work, her voice in the wilderness. As they seized her tablet, a low moan began outside, a sound that grew in pitch and volume with terrifying speed. The blizzard, which had been forecast for days, hit the camp with the sudden explosive force of a bomb. The tent fabric snapped and strained. The howl of the wind became a deafening, all-consuming scream, as if the white silence itself had come to reclaim its dead. The camp was cut off. They were trapped. The storm was a living thing. For 2 days and nights, it had screamed and clawed at the thin fabric of the camp, a relentless assault of wind and ice that frayed nerves and eroded hope. Confined to her tent, Elara was a prisoner, stripped of her research and her authority. Larsen had taken her scientific tools, but he hadn't taken her mind. And he hadn't known about the personal satellite phone she kept packed in the bottom of her gear for true emergencies. This, she decided, qualified. Under the dim glow of a battery-powered lantern, she dialed the number, the signal struggling against the atmospheric chaos. When Kaelin's voice finally crackled through the speaker, static-laced and distant, she didn't waste time. She described the carvings, the swirling lichen, the serene, upturned face of the worshipper. She expected surprise, perhaps even disbelief. Instead, there was only a long, weary sigh from the other end of the line. "Ah!" Kaelin's voice was heavy with ancient sorrow. "So you have seen the invitation." "Invitation?" Elara whispered, the roar of the wind outside almost swallowing her words. The stone dream is not a cure, Dr. Holm. It is a temptation, the elder explained. A promise of peace when the world offers only hardship. The Silanap Nipasua, the white silence, it does not hunt. It is not a monster. It is a presence. It waits. It watches. And when people are at their weakest, when the cold has seeped into their bones and their spirit is thin, it offers them a way out. The carvings are not a story of what happened. They are a sign that the land itself is dreaming, and it is inviting others to join. Elara, the scientist, the pragmatist, felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. She was listening to a ghost story, a piece of folklore. But in the howling darkness, with the memory of those serene dead faces burned into her mind, it felt like the most rational explanation in the world. She was no longer just investigating the past. She was trapped inside its echo. By the third day, the controlled scientific environment of the camp had disintegrated into a state of primal fear. The mess tent, once a place of collegial debate, was now thick with suspicion and a suffocating claustrophobia. The main generator was flickering, casting the room in a nauseating strobe of light and shadow. One of the geological technicians was curled on a cot, his skin hot with fever, muttering deliriously. Larsen's authority was in tatters. His commands were met with sullen glares or outright defiance. He paced the tent like a caged animal, his anger a thin veneer over his own terror. In the midst of the decay, a small act of rebellion. Ben, his face pale and drawn, slipped into Elara's tent. He thrust a handful of crumpled papers at her printouts of her notes on the Lichen's chemical structure he'd managed to save before Larsen confiscated everything. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his eyes darting toward the tent flap. "What he did was wrong. We need you." "Ben, you shouldn't have," she said, though she gratefully took the notes. "I can't sleep, Elara," he confessed, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Every time I close my eyes, I hear it. That music. It's in the wind. It sounds beautiful. It sounds like peace." His confession hung in the air, a terrifying validation of her deepest fears. The lure that had claimed the Vikings a millennium ago was now whispering to her friend. The end came that night. With a final, sputtering groan, the main generator died. The lights went out, plunging the entire camp into absolute darkness, broken only by the chaotic flashing red of the emergency beacons. Shouts of panic and confusion echoed between the tents. In the disorienting red strobes, Elara's first thought was of Ben. She scrambled for her parka and a flashlight, her heart hammering against her ribs. His tent was empty. She burst outside, fighting her way through the disorienting, wind-whipped darkness. The storm was a solid wall of white, a disorienting hell of snow and roaring wind. Then, her flashlight beam caught him. He was 50 meters out, at the very edge of the camp's perimeter. He wasn't running. He wasn't panicked. He was walking, calmly and deliberately, into the whiteout. "Ben!" she screamed, her voice instantly ripped away by the wind. He didn't turn. He just kept walking. As she got closer, the beam of her light fell upon his face, and the final, horrifying piece of the puzzle clicked into place. He was smiling. It was a faint, serene, blissful smile, his eyes wide and unfocused. It was the exact same expression she had seen on the face of the frozen Viking woman, the same look of rapturous peace carved into the stone of the longhouse. He was not walking to his death. He was walking toward his salvation. The white silence had claimed another. There was no time for thought, no time for fear. There was only the driving, primal instinct to not let the white take him. Elara plunged into the storm, her flashlight cutting a frantic, useless beam into the swirling chaos. Ben's footprints were faint depressions, already being erased by the wind, a fading path to oblivion. She had her scientific tools, a GPS in her glove, a radio she knew was useless, and a flare gun tucked inside her parka, its weight a small, cold comfort. But her true map was a story, the dying echo of Lichen words in her head. He had spoken of a rock formation, a place where the wind gathered, shaped like a listening ear, a place where the silence was strongest. She keyed the approximate coordinates from the camp's geological survey into her GPS, praying the signal would hold. She was trying to intercept him, to beat him to a place she only knew from folklore. The wind was no longer just a physical force. It was a voice. The beautiful phantom melody she had heard Ben describe was now weaving its way into her own mind. It was an inviting sound, a promise that the struggle could end, that there was peace to be found just by closing her eyes, by lying down and letting the snow become a blanket. For a terrifying second, she felt the pull, a deep, cellular desire to surrender. Her legs felt heavy. Rest sounded so sweet. She shook her head, the motion violent. Hypoxia, she muttered, her scientific mind grasping for a rational anchor. Auditory hallucination. But the part of her that was now running on pure instinct knew it was more than that. She was in a fight not just against the storm, but against her own mind's desire for peace. Through the whiteout, a dark shape began to resolve itself. A large, concave rock formation, unnaturally smooth, hollowed out by centuries of wind into the shape of a listening ear. And there, at its focal point, was Ben. He was kneeling in the snow, his back to her, perfectly still. He was smiling at the rock as if it were a lover, his face a mask of rapturous bliss. The air around him was thick with a fine, shimmering dust, billions of tiny lichen spores dancing in the beam of her flashlight. In that instant, everything synthesized. Lichen lore, her science. They weren't two different stories. They were two parts of the same map. The listening ear wasn't just folklore, it was an acoustic amplifier. The spores weren't just a toxin, they were a neurostimulant that opened the mind to suggestion. And the melody on the wind was the suggestion, a psychoacoustic signal that promised an end to all pain. It was a perfect, elegant, deadly sensory trap. And Elara, armed with both ancient wisdom and modern knowledge, was the only one who could see how it worked. She pulled the flare gun from her parka. She couldn't fight the silence with silence. She had to answer its whisper with a roar. She aimed the gun not at the sky, but directly into the heart of the concave rock. The flare exploded with a deafening, percussive whoomph. The blinding white light of burning magnesium turned the night to day, incinerating the shimmering spores. The sound, amplified and distorted by the concave rock, became a physically painful, chaotic shriek of feedback that tore through the air. The beautiful melody did not fade, it shattered like glass. The spell was broken. Ben cried out, a raw human sound of pure terror, and collapsed, clutching his head as if trying to force the shriek out. The serene smile was gone, replaced by the wild-eyed confusion of someone ripped from a dream. The storm was still a storm, but that's all it was now, wind and ice. The presence was gone. Elara rushed forward, grabbing his arm, pulling him to his feet, and began the long, hard walk back to the world of the living. Months later, the sterile quiet of a university lecture hall had replaced the howl of the Greenlandic wind. Elara stood at a podium, the final slide of her presentation glowing on the screen behind her. It showed a detailed toxicological report next to a high-resolution photo of the carvings. Her lecture had been a masterclass in scientific analysis, a brilliant deconstruction of how environmental pressures and the ingestion of a native psychoactive lichen led to the formation of a unique and ultimately fatal death cult among a lost Viking settlement. She had given them a story they could understand, a story that could be peer-reviewed. She said nothing of the white silence, of melodies on the wind, of a smile that could cross 1,000 years. When she finished, a hand went up in the back. A young, bright-eyed graduate student. "Dr. Holm," he began, "it's a fascinating theory, but are you saying that they just went insane?" Elara paused, her gaze drifting toward the window, at the blue sky and the green leaves of a world that felt impossibly, blessedly alive. She thought of Ben, who remembered nothing but a vague, beautiful dream, She thought of the serene smile on the face of the Viking woman. Her answer, when it came, was not for the student, or for the university, or for the scientific record. It was for herself. "They found a kind of peace," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Whether they chose it or it chose them, that's not a question science can answer." What do you do with a mystery that science can only partly solve? The story of these lost Vikings gives us a perfect and perfectly unsettling answer: a psychoactive lichen. We have the toxicology, the anthropology, the neat label of a death cult. Science gives us the how. It is a clean, logical explanation for why an entire village would starve with a full pantry. But does it really explain the why? Does a lab report capture the meaning behind those serene, smiling faces in the ice? This is where the story gets under your skin. Because alongside the scientific data, we have the Inuit elders' story of the white silence, a presence that offers a peaceful escape when life becomes unbearable. This explanation isn't provable. It's a myth, a superstition, and yet it feels more complete, doesn't it? It speaks to the human truth of their surrender in a way that chemical analysis never could. In the end, our protagonist, Dr. Holm, chooses to live with both truths. She publishes the facts, but she carries the weight of the story. It makes you wonder about the nature of explanation itself. So here is my question for you. When science explains the how, but a story explains the why, which one tells us more about who we really are?